following are some thoughts I've had about why some people are so stuck and why it is so hard for them to be helped by almost anybody, including content creators who think they got great ideas, which they might call a better mousetrap, or maybe they think that they are in the movies out in Iowa where the Field of Dreams field was built, and it said, if you build it, they will come, starring Kevin Costner. So here are some thoughts I have as to why so many people these days especially are so stuck. First, I would say because there are so many ways to not only escape reality, but to escape consequences for their actions being accurately assessed. Some would call this escaping responsibility for their actions. But at any rate, there are many, many escapes these days that didn't exist 100 years ago. This includes a variety of types of tranquilizers, especially since 1951 with the advent of Thorazine. It also includes a massive amount of electronic distractors and print distractors, shall we say, such as radio, TV, satellite TV, DVDs, the internet, and anything that streams from the internet too, of a visual nature or audio nature. Of course, the web on the internet has provided a massive influx of information too. And transportation has been cheaper and cheaper all the time, and phone calls too. And then there's the iPhone and cell phones in general. And did I mention that with transportation comes quicker and quicker package and mail delivery? And emails have speeded that up immensely too, such that typical mail is now called snail mail. And as for what you would call evading responsibility of a sort, that's a somewhat toxic term, but some would say blame shifting. There are a variety of ways these days also, such as trying to ruin somebody else's reputation, or trying to, in general, enact a situation where they are stigmatized, to include calling them mentally ill. And the whole concept being, in my opinion, questionable, very much so. And even to the extent that these individuals so labeled might be encouraged highly to take tranquilizers that numb their brains and have other consequences too, in many directions. This last bit is somewhat controversial, but it's not uncommon a phenomenon. I'm holding a book in my hands right now I checked out of the library recently, entitled The Woman They Could Not Silence. One woman, her incredible fight for freedom, and the men who tried to make her disappear. It's written by Kate Moore, Moore. I would have at this point a few diagnostic questions to prompt thoughts, and then I have a few suggestions or answers as to what pops in my head. First, I would say Many people don't know they're quite so stuck until they meet someone who is relatively less stuck, upon which time I believe the word envy or jealousy quite applies, and quite a bit of anger if the person they see unstuck cannot help them in turn become unstuck, or provide hope that that could happen incrementally or differently in the future. And some questions here then, kind of like diagnostic questions to jog a person. Why don't they quit their job or get out of their career? It's been said by many people that most people aren't even happy in their careers. Why don't they get a divorce in some cases, if applicable? Why don't they leave the urban jungle, sometimes called the rat race? And if they say they don't have the money, why don't they get a van then? And if their spouse or partner doesn't want to go along with the idea, why don't they get a divorce if it's in their best interest, or a separation? And in response, these are some thoughts that come to my mind these days. That first of all, leaving a job or a career isn't all as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of legal ramifications that result in more than just discomfort. For instance, there is the matter of the sunk costs that they put in to getting that job or career. College expenses, for instance, or let's say if they pursued a Ph.D. or M.D. degree, they might be in debt quite a bit, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know of one woman who was under 30 who went to medical school and incurred a $100,000 loan each year. And she isn't even practicing medicine per se yet. I believe a succinct word for this would be sunk costs. Noting, by the way, not everybody knows that college student loan debt is undischargeable in bankruptcy court. Additionally, though, by sunk costs, it's not discussed much the sunk cost of your youthhood in many ways. That after a certain point in time, you become less and less employable. Your mind starts to become less speedy. Memory starts to fade more and more per year. And you become less desirable on the dating market, so to speak. In many cases, that is. And as per divorce, there's the matter of the cost involved for a lawyer and the very unpredictable outcome of the whole thing, depending in part on the lawyer you obtain, but, in general, it's just a serendipitous affair. You just don't know with any degree of certainty how it'll turn out. You may hope to get the equivalent of O.J. Simpson's lawyer, but even there, the results are not guaranteed. And there will be perhaps custody battles over children, much anguish too, and you might say lost faith sometimes, or in other words, self-esteem injuries, depending on how it turns out. And it could just be a bloody affair any which way you look at it. And again, costly in terms of money and time, and emotional suffering overall, not to mention the impact upon the children, by the way. And that impact on the children, not only upon their psyches, but how they view the parents in future years. And even how that might impact the children's willingness to later caretake the parents in their old age. Indeed, there are several people that come to my mind who are males who didn't come out so well in the divorce courts. For instance, there's the man William Shatner from playing Star Trek 3 episodes, who shortly thereafter went through divorce. And I would say, for lack of a better word, didn't come out so well. Some would say got cleaned out. And he ended up living in a pickup truck with a camper top, I believe on the outskirts of Los Angeles in the desert area, doing birthday parties on the weekends to raise money. And had quite a comeback, though. Emergency 911, Boston Legal, and so on. And Star Trek movies, per se. Another man, Bob Wells, who has had the YouTube channel Cheap RV Living, and now hosts an event each year for many years out in Quartzsite, Arizona, and helps many people with RV issues and more. Went through a divorce years ago, too. And the result was that he couldn't even afford an apartment, and after child support and alimony were being paid and whatever else. And so he bought a box van for perhaps $1,500 and moved into it for 6 years in Alaska with no windows in the box van. And he had to run 2 heaters in the winter to keep warm inside. So I would call this effect humorously going to court and getting William Shatnered. This is not a small deal. And as for leaving the rat race, so to speak, Bob Wells put it so well that it's quite hard at first to adapt to having to live without all the distractions, or at least I would clarify it that way myself. Albert Camus, the philosopher, who died in his 40s incidentally, said that it's very hard to live in a room with your thoughts. There's a musician whose name escapes me who did this very thing, and it rejuvenated his career when he was able to pass through that himself. There's also the matter that if you leave what I call Urbania, you will have to adapt to a very different type of person, politically and religiously. Pluses and minuses involved, and many people could not very well adapt in such a manner. And of course, your spouse might very well not want to come with you. Followed, by the way, if you pursued it, by a divorce proceedings. I would also say, too, that many people don't know their options. The idea, say, of getting a van or RV or even living in a tent prompts so many thoughts and questions like, where would you do this and how, logistics and so on. But moreover, the omnipresent thought of that you would be considered homeless and that relatives, including your children, might worry about you. They might even envy you, some people. So you would have that issue too, being envied for getting out of the rat race. And to backtrack, let's say one suffered a misfortune from negative outturns in a divorce, say, or whatever. And, that might shift one into a different social class completely. And one might find oneself formerly having a quote-unquote professional career with much more income financially, much more status, much more power in many ways. One might find oneself now in a situation where one's flipping hamburgers and living in a rat-infested and cockroach-infested apartment in the ghettos and struggling with 2 jobs to pay for that whole new way of life. And now, and perhaps even incurring some stigmas, certainly a loss of status. It's way too much for many to handle. In fact, I read years ago that some people convicted of crimes in court for white-collar criminal crimes sometimes were sentenced to very little in the conventional sense because the judge felt that their stepping down as per loss of reputation was punishment enough. noting in general that lost status, in my book, equals lost power in many conventional ways of deeming it. And of course, if one was prone to comparing oneself to the Joneses and keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, as a yardstick for who one is, one's value, and so on, and progress in life, I would say that getting out of the rat race or downsizing in many ways would require a whole new set of yardsticks. And one would no longer be able to say, oh, I can keep up with these Joneses as neighbors. And in general, if their identity in general was formed upon their income level or their status, the degree of power they might have had at one point, and feeling of protection too from status in a certain social class or job title they once held, all of that, that's quite problematic then to reorient oneself around if major changes are made. So, there's a phrase that comes to my mind, get out of your comfort zone. But, in some cases, it's even more than comfort zone issues that many things I've just outlined now might pertain to. Because with certain shifts, shall we say, downward in some people's opinion, that might even result in prison time. Let's say if a person coming out of a divorce court in the wrong sense has to pay child support and alimony and can't, what then? They might go to prison for a while. Or simply losing power could result in vulnerability to lawsuits and arrests that were of a level unknown to a person beforehand when they had certain degrees of power and of certain types, which they now lost. So it's not just a matter of getting out of your comfort zone in many cases that is an issue here, keeping people stuck so often, but much more. They might say that there's considerable risk they might end up in prison or homeless. And if homeless, during the daytime when they're generally forced out of the homeless shelters to fend for themselves, they might be picked up for vagrancy and put in prison and go down the rabbit hole there in many ways. So it's not just a matter of getting out of a comfort zone, much more than that. It's a matter of feeling one's safety threatened in terms of arrest, imprisonment, ruined reputation completely, and that impact on one's earning power, dating power, marriage power, friendship power, and of course self-respect loss in many ways, which is not a small deal either. One might pick up stigmas against oneself, certain labels. So that is why I believe so many of us are stuck, and why content creators, for instance, might naively think, as I often have too, that we can help others when we don't understand the constraints involved in some people's lives. It's not spoken of very often, or not congealed into one succinct package of ideas. I hope some of these ideas help some people, to get more of a handle on this whole thing, or just prompt more thought. This should be just considered food for thought, not definitive, and is my opinion. But I hope it's more than just a conjecture at this point in my life at age 61. That's it for now on this topic.